This project started as just my own curiosity. I live not far from Mack's Landing, and I walk a lot. And I love walking through the neighborhood. I just began getting interested, and so I started digging into the history, and pretty soon I realized there wasn't a whole lot out there. There wasn't a whole lot of information. It was kind of spread all over the place. And I could only find a few people who had personal connections. Now, that doesn't mean they're not out there, right? I just haven't found them yet. So this is still a work in progress. Nevertheless, I've been able to piece together some bits and pieces, and I think you can find it interesting. So I have two goals tonight. One is to begin telling the story of a place that is pretty much forgotten, right? And that's hence the name Forgotten Landings. And the other is I'm hoping to scare up a few leads and maybe a few more tidbits from you all who may know people or may know something yourself. The title of the talk is Forgotten Landings, and it centers on Mack's Landing. So if you're not familiar with Mack's Landing, we're here in Douglas, right? So if you come down Wiley Road, right, you go across the highway, some of you know where the DNR boat launch is, right? That's sort of at the edge of the area we're going to talk about. So this is what I talk of when I talk about Mack's Landing. New Richmond is over here. Here's Old Allegan Road. So does that kind of situate you, kind of have an idea where I'm talking about? Because if you don't, the rest of it's going to say, what the heck is he talking about? I've kind of divided up into these categories, and we'll just go through them as the time goes through. It kind of looks like Jeopardy categories, I thought, when I looked at it there. But here we go. A lot of people have landed on the Kalamazoo River before Europeans ever got here, or before they even knew this continent existed. Humans first came here 11,000 years ago when the glaciers were still up in the UP, covering the UP. And of course you can see, some of you can see that Lake Michigan looks a lot different than it does today. We're down here, right? So things were a lot different back then. Those first people probably came here following mastodons or some other animals that they were hunting, and we're not exactly sure how they got here, but they came through Russia and Asia and got here. So they were hunting animals. And they tell us, the archaeologists tell us, that originally a lot of this area along the river was seasonally used by the indigenous people for hunting, fishing, and even making maple sugar. In the 1970s, archaeologists from western Michigan did extensive work at a site in the Mack's Landing area. And they uncovered more than 80,000 stone artifacts and 20,000 potsherds, including the one here on the left. And it's actually a pretty important site. They named that type of pottery after the site. These Paleo-Americans, as we could call them, knew how to make dugout canoes. In fact, they may have known that before they ever came into this continent. And so a vessel like this one was probably the first one that landed on the river. The History Center owns this one. This is another dugout canoe. And this was made in 1844 by Joe Shashagwe, who was a Pottawatomi Indian who lived across the river from Mack's Landing. His Aunt Joe's Algonquin ancestors also invented birch bark canoes, which were harder to make, but they're stronger and lighter than dugouts. And that's what the French voyageurs were probably using when they were the first Europeans to see the river in 1675. They were the first ones to see the river, we think. But the first ones to actually land on the river, the first people to land other than the Native Americans, were actually American fur traders. This is an 1870 picture of Louis Campau, who sounds French, but he was a Detroiter who was credited with founding Grand Rapids. He looks like a barrel of laughs, doesn't he? I mean, geez. In the early 1820s, he landed at several spots on the Kalamazoo and set up fur trading posts. In 1837, James McCormick, here's the answer to the question from earlier, James McCormick settled near Fennville, and he kept a canoe on the river for fishing and transportation, maybe at one of the remains of Louis Campau's trading posts. Right? Some of the things that I've read say that that's where the location was. And James McCormick's landing spot became known as Mack's Landing. McCormick, Mack, right? Today, it's actually, the place where it was is actually located inside of Riverside Estates, the mobile home park. James Mack McCormick became a major fruit grower, and his house that he built in Fennville in 1853 still sits there on 124th Street. Now, New Richmond was a good place to connect to cities east of our area. The Allegan Road crossed the river there, and starting in 1871, the train went through there. There's a whole history to that, but the train doesn't obviously go through Saugatuck, and it never did, right? Except the interurban that came down from Holland. And so it was a really important place to connect with. You could ride a stagecoach the 5 miles from Saugatuck to New Richmond, but there was also a lot of traffic of goods and people on the river. It was about 3 miles on the river from the lake to Saugatuck, and here are some of the landing spots. So we had Shriver's Bend, right? And of course the river back in those days came out here, right? As opposed to up here in the early days. Shriver's Bend, Singapore, right? Mount Baldhead, and then Saugatuck. So it was 3 miles to there. It was another 3 miles from there to Mack's Landing. So you'd go through Douglas and St. Pierre Point, and I'm not sure that that's where it is, but that's where I think it was, because I couldn't find out where it was on the map. I just know it was a landing. The Peach Orchard, which is also called Gerber's Landing, Indian Cut, they may have come up to go there or not, and then they would get to Mack's Landing. And so there was this southern course of the river that they would follow off to New Richmond. And New Richmond was another 4 miles from there. So they'd get to Red Banks, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And then was a stop called Mann's Creek, which was almost there in New Richmond. And then finally they would get to where the road and the train would meet in New Richmond. So that's a little bit about the early landings. The Purdy family, though, they're kind of the rock stars of the story of Mack's Landing. They figure in a lot of the things that happened. And there were 4 brothers and sisters. This isn't them. I'm going to show you who they are in a minute. But it's a great picture. Erastus Purdy and his brother Philetas, or Fleet, came here from Lockport, New York in 1854. And they lived at a shanty for a while in Mack's Landing. Again, it could have been that same place where Mack stopped his boat. First they worked at Henry Barringer's brickyard, and then they worked at John Mead's sawmill. For a while, Fleet, I love that name, that nickname, went prospecting out west at Pikes Peak, but he came back. And his brother Erastus spent 3 years fighting in the Civil War. In 1857, Erastus married Amelia Wilson, and they had 13 children. Fleet wasn't quite so prolific. In 1858, Fleet married Susan Hogmeyer, who was a widow. She had married another Mead, and she had a son named Henry Mead when Fleet married her. Fleet and Susan had a daughter, Alyce May Purdy, who was born in 1862. In 1865, after the Civil War, right, things were calming down, I guess, 2 more Purdys came. A sister, Jane Purdy, who had married Francis Clark, and he comes back into the story a little bit later as well, came. And then the baby of the family was James K. Polk Purdy. And if that name sounds familiar, James K. Polk Purdy was born 10 days after Polk was elected president in, I think it was 1844. So I get a kick out of it. They called him Polk. So I got a little bit confused about the family tree, so I actually put a family tree together, and there it does show up. These are the people who are in the photo, but I love the picture. It's Polk and his wife and his daughter, and I'm guessing it's when she was getting married. It looks pretty formal. She looks young enough to be, I think she got married when she was like 26. So in 1866, Fleet started buying up land, and what would eventually become a 125-acre farm that was called Riverside Farm. That's the area in light green. And by 1886, you can see that his family had owned quite a bit of land. So here's his stepson, Henry Mead. Here's his brother, James. Here's his his brother-in-law, Francis Clark, right? And they own just a heck of a lot of land out there in the area. There's not much left in terms of buildings from that time, but there are two houses. There's a house that George Waldo built that's across from the mobile home park on Riverside. And then there's a house that Matthew Reeks built in 1880, which I think is it Bob Jacobsma? Does that name ring a bell? Rob? I believe he owns that house. So here's the dock. I love this picture. Here's the dock at Mack's Landing. I'm thinking it's in the 1870s, perhaps. Also known on some of the maps as Purdy's Landing. The forests in our area were pretty much doomed at this point, right? They were just stripping the land. They weren't thinking too much about sustainability in those days. And on top of that, in October of 1871, there was this awful fire. And it destroyed a lot of the trees and a lot of the buildings, a lot of Purdy's buildings. That's one of the reasons why none of the houses that you see up there were built until after that. The first house that's remaining out there was built in 1875. And the fire, yes?
So in 1871, that was a Chicago fire?
The Chicago fire, the Peshtigo fire, the Holland fire, they were all...
Here too.
Yeah, and it was pretty nasty. It was pretty nasty.
Saugatuck-Douglas weren't affected by it.
Fennville was hit pretty bad, and this area was hit pretty bad. I don't remember, I actually looked at the commercial record, and I don't remember him saying much about Saugatuck or Douglas being hit very hard by it. So that fire was a big part of the end of the large-scale lumbering, and by 1872, pretty much everybody was planting peaches. This may very well, it's kind of grainy, but there are these two men on these logs that they're floating down, and I like to think that that's Erastus and Fleet Purdy floating logs down from red banks. This is another picture that I love. Here's a picture from 1898. This is Fleet Purdy and his buddies at Charlevoix. They're there for a little relaxation. They're probably playing Old Maid. That's what I think, you know. And here's Fleet up close on the left. In 1874, he went out west again to try his luck, but he returned a couple years later and settled down for good. I don't exactly get that, you know. He must have had people at home who took care of the farm while he was gone or something. Here's the Purdy spread. This is another picture that I love. This is in winter, and this is looking toward Mack's Landing from the river. Here's the same shed, right? That's the dock, and the logs that they've rolled down, either from their land or from upriver, are just waiting to be taken down to the mills in Saugatuck and Douglas. And this in the middle, again, it's really grainy, but you can see the house a little bit better. This is the only picture I've found of Riverside Farm. I would dearly love to see a photograph of that house that they owned. It burned down in 1878, or 1978. I'll tell you more about that. But it was described as a large, ornate home, a beacon for travelers. And I'm guessing that's Fleet at the left. These were pictures that are in the History Center's collection. They have Alyce Purdy's name on there. I don't know if she took them or if she just kept a hold of them. Fleet was really a very successful fruit farmer. In 1879, the Mack's Landing dock handled 12,000 baskets of fruit. And here's a little tidbit from the Michigan State Horticultural Society. The Purdy peach is a marvel on account of its wonderful size and surpassing beauty. It sold last year for $3 to $5 a basket. One tree yielded Mr. Purdy 25 baskets. In 1881, Fleet Purdy and George Arnold built a 78-foot side-wheeled riverboat, and he named it after his daughter. Reportedly, Alyce wasn't too fond of the loud noise of the horn. And this boat, as you can see, if you can read this, it would travel from Saugatuck to New Richmond, charge 50 cents for the fare. And unfortunately, in 1887, it caught fire in Saugatuck Harbor and sank. Alyce Purdy is a really interesting person. This is Fleet Purdy's daughter, right? After the 8th grade, I'm guessing after the 8th grade, she attended the Michigan Female Seminary in Kalamazoo, which is basically a prep school. And on Fridays, I'm just guessing here, I'm thinking she took the train home from Kalamazoo to New Richmond, right? And then she could spend the day with her family. But on Sunday, she had to be back at the seminary for church. That was required. In 1882, she married William Dawson and moved to Chicago. The English-born Dawson and his brother had a successful business, a really successful business, selling fireplace mantles and grates. They're actually, highly sought-after antiques on the internet if you look for them. The factory that they had covered an entire block in Chicago, and this building is still there. And if you could see it, it says Dawson Brothers, 1888 on the front of it. In 1899, poor Mr. Dawson was hit by a cable car and he died. And his wife returned to Riverside Farm. I'm guessing she didn't return destitute though, which I'm just curious. I would love to see the will, just out of curiosity. And then when Fleet Purdy died in 1922, she inherited the farm. 1923 saw a really nasty car accident. She was driving, Purdy was driving down the road, and it was bumpy, and they must have, you can read the article there, but her cousin, Anna Worthing, was in the car, and she must have jumped out of the car and she was killed. In June 1946, the aging Mrs. Dawson transferred much of her land to Lucy Gore, who was, the paper said she was her devoted and constant companion for 30 years. The census says she was their servant or housekeeper, but who knows? She died a couple of months later. Alyce Purdy died in 1946. And as I mentioned in the beginning, there was only one public building in Mack's Lane. There were no churches, there were no stores, but there was a school. The Saugatuck Township District opened a school in 1873, a mile south of Mack's Landing on 62nd Street. One source says that first the school was a little farther north, but I think that was because one of the atlases actually put it at the wrong place on the map. Because the building that still exists claims to have been built in 1873. Lucy Clark Reeks, who was the sister of Fleet Purdy's brother-in-law, was the first teacher. And she married Matthew Reeks, who was a very successful logger. He's the one who built the house that Rob Jacobs lives in. So it was another local person. In 1880, I found that the average teacher in Saugatuck made $180 per year. And then we say, oh, well, just correct that for inflation. Well, correct it for inflation, that's $5,385. They did not make a lot of money. The original building, with a few modifications, still stands. The Van Hamen family, some of you know, Cat Van Hamen, has lived there since 2017. And it was kind of falling apart, but the inside is beautiful. They've read it. Doesn't look like a school at all inside, but it's beautiful. And the outside of the building is in great shape. I love walking by there. Every time I walk by there, I think, what it would have been like when it was a school. And there are 3 other one-room schools within 3 miles that are still standing. The Barringer School on 64th, the Loomis School down the street from me on 63rd, and between my house and the Loomis School is the Peachtree School, where Dawn Stafford had her, the Peach Belt School, where Dawn Stafford has her studio. And I just love that there's 4 one-rooms. I'm a retired teacher, that there are 4 one-room schoolhouses that are still standing that close to my house. School has changed a lot since 1873. In the early days, paper was expensive, so children used slates. That changed by the early 1900s. At the Mack's Landing School, there were no school buses, of course, so of course everybody walked, and these schools were designed to be close enough to people's homes that they could walk. There were no clubs or after-school activities, right? There's not enough critical mass to do that. The desks, I found this was interesting, the desks were still bolted to the floor until 1937. And one of the teachers was quite innovative. She decided to unbolt the desks so they could be rearranged. And they didn't get an indoor toilet until 1947. Which again, if you lived in those days, today that sounds weird, but it wasn't that strange that people wouldn't have an indoor toilet at that time. I love this. This is the 5th grade diploma from Fennville. I found this in the library, in the Fennville library. This is a treasure. This is a picture of the school class from 1948, April 1948. The teacher is Mrs. Viola Montague. Did any of you ever know any of the Montagues? Yeah, they were a family in Douglas. And she, in this picture, has just finished a very eventful 10 months. I love this. I just managed to sleuth this out. She turned 19. She graduated from Western Michigan Normal School, probably a 2-year program to become a teacher, right? She got married like the month before she started teaching, and then she started teaching. I mean, her head has to be like exploding right now. I've spoken with 2 of the students in the picture. Some of you may know one or both of them. Lee Johnson Scow and Dean Johnson. Dean lives on Fremont. And it was really fun to talk to these people who actually had gone to the school. Lee remembered that once Mrs. Montague was making macaroni for lunch, and of course she's 19, right? She's not a cook. She didn't realize that you were supposed to drain the macaroni before you put the cheese on it. And here it is 50, 70 years later, and she remembers that. It's crazy. That Lee would remember that. Mrs. Montague had several children, and so she certainly became much more macaroni savvy over time, I'm sure. Another teacher that some of you may have know about was Mrs. Mary Wark, and she had taught in Fennville and Douglas for 32 years. Her house, which is around the corner from where I live, was on the way to school for the Johnsons. They lived on 126th Street, and they would walk up that street and then come up 64th or 62nd to the school. And her house was halfway, and so in the winter it was really cold. And Mrs. Wark was on a year off of teaching that year, and so she would just invite him in to come in and have a little cocoa and get warmed up, which I think is a great little story. The Mack's Landing School didn't have much of a playground, but Lee told me they did have a swing like this one in the picture, and theirs had a little canvas awning on top of it. The last teacher at the school was Patricia Audette, Miss Patricia Audette. She was appointed in the summer of 1962, and the school closed in 1963. The school bell passed on to the Audette family, and they refurbished it, and it now hangs down the street from my house at Jim Hanson's house. So Dee Dee and Jim Hanson, she was Patsy Audette was their aunt. The school building sat largely unused for quite a while, and finally it was sold in 1979 as a personal residence. Thankfully, not all life in Mack's Landing was all work and no play. There were some fun things going on too. Hunting was popular, as you can imagine, as a source of food and recreation. This is another great photo that I love. It's a little hard to see, so I'll describe it a little bit to you. It's a gun club. It's an 1878 picture of a gun club in Fennville. Everyone in the picture is male, and all 36 of them are wearing a hat. I always think that's funny, back in the day, even in the 50s, any man who went on the street basically wore a hat, I believe. And this is more evidence of. The other thing I noticed, I counted, there are a maximum of 3 of them who are smiling. They all look very serious. Maybe they're just being macho or something, I don't know. In 1885, the Pottawatomi Gun Club was formed, and they acquired 1,225 acres of land. This was an interesting little project just to sort of figure out, what they own. It's a lot of land. It's the oldest duck hunting club in Michigan. Of course, it's right across the river from Mack's Landing. I haven't been able to learn a whole lot about the club. I know they have a clubhouse here at the end of Pottawatomi Trail. So here's Old Allegan, and the Pottawatomi Trail is a little bit of a development here near where you guys live, right, Jane? And so down at the end is a clubhouse. I've tried to get, there's a Mr. Engel, who's been, their family has been the caretakers of this place basically since it began. And he's a busy man. They run a charter service, and he said, yeah, I'll take you over there, but I haven't been able to get over there yet. My impression of this group, even though I haven't learned a whole lot about it, is that it's a bunch of wealthy men from Grand Rapids, basically. And, okay, that's all right. And as a matter of fact, I kind of like it. This is all land that's not being developed, right? I mean, it's not great land for building anyway, but they're keeping it clean for the ducks. They're keeping it to be good, healthy land. They're helping to keep the river navigable, right? And they're doing it all on their own nickel, which, I don't fault them for that. About 10 years ago, some of you may remember there was a bit of a stink because they were clearing some land, so they did a prescribed burn. It was in the news, I guess. But again, they were just trying to get rid of the invasive species and make the land more helpful, was my understanding. The Sunshine Society was another big deal in Mack's Landing. Some of you probably have heard about that. This was an international group whose goal was to bring the sunshine of happiness into hearts and homes. And the way I understand it, it was partly a reaction to the secretive social groups, the societies, and all their rituals and everything. This is a much more above board and kind of happy group. They did a lot to help the blind, the elderly, orphans, and working women. And at the peak, it had 500,000 members in 38 states and 9 countries. So it was a significant group. The members wore these yellow sunshine pins or something like this. I don't think that's, it might be like a cousin of the Sunshine Society pin. They upheld the motto, good cheer, and sang the Sunshine Society song, Scatter Sunshine. It started in 1900, the group did. And as it turned out, the group in Fennville basically organized that year. They saw this thing and they thought, this is great, so we're going to have one of these. And within a few months, they had 100 members. There were some men at first, but it gradually became a women's group. On the screen, you can see one of the regular updates that appeared in the commercial record. So it talks about sunshine letters being written and sent. It talks about passing on clothing to worthy parties, scattering sunshine, and passing on reading matter. I love this sentence. Mrs. Gridley and Mrs. Mills paid their dues by keeping fresh air children for a month. I didn't even know that fresh air was that old of a movement, but it basically city kids who would come and you would stay there for a month and they would get some fresh air. And that was a big deal at the turn of the century, late 1900s, early turn of the century, getting particularly kids out of the city into the fresh air. So interesting stuff, and it says new members here, Philetas, Purdy, and Henry Mead joined that month. The group did things like loaning out wheelchairs and crutches and supplying food to the needy. And every year they had a penny auction, which evidently was a fairly successful way to raise money. I'm not exactly sure how it worked, but they raised money that way. In the 1970s, they dropped out of the international organization, and I know the group stayed active for a time, but I don't know if it's still active. I believe the people in the library told me there's still a Sunshine Club at Fennville High School. But I don't know. I found some obituaries of ladies who said that in Fennville, who said they had been members, but I don't know if that was 30 years ago or what. So there are 2 other landings that are part of this story. First, a little bit about the river. The early traffic, as I said, took this southern path through Mack's Landing. But by 1900, this northern path was becoming much more interesting. And one of the stories was that there were people who worked up in this area, loggers, and they did some sort of surreptitious work to make this channel clearer. By 1909, though, the water at Mack's Landing was still, it wasn't moving. And Fleet Purdy went to the government and tried to get them to do something about it, but they said, nope, sorry. Another resident, William Stowe, who I believe lived a little bit east of Mack's Landing, took things into his own land and started dynamiting a new channel. And we know who owned this area, right? The gun club was not too happy about Mr. Stowe dynamiting land, so he had to stop. For a while, boats still picked up fruit at Mack's Landing, but by 1920, it was pretty much no longer viable as a commercial landing spot. Plus, 1920, people were starting to use trucks, right?
A few years ago, the Pottawatomi Club themselves were going to do the dynamiting
Oh, really?
thing to create more open water.
No kidding.
It didn't happen, but I saw some video of places that had done it. It was quite a dramatic event.
Ironic, huh? Interesting. So one of the landings that's still in use, some of you, this may look familiar, is the Hacklander boat launch on the south bank at the end of 63rd Street. A 2-mile walk from my house. So if I want a nice 4-mile hike, I walk to the lake, the river and back, and it's great. George and Stella Hacklander bought this land in 1928. They didn't buy it directly from Fleet Purdy, but there was only a few years in between when someone else had owned it. For 2 decades, George ran a boat livery. I'm thinking it was over here somewhere at the northeast corner of the property. George's brother, Jack Hacklander, lived right across the river. It was 100 yards, I actually measured it. It's just 100 yards across the river, and so they would canoe back and forth to visit each other. In 1941, the Hacklanders sold the northern part of their land, this darker area here, to the DNR. And eventually the DNR opened their boat launch. I don't know when. I haven't been able to find anything about when it actually opened. I know it was opened by the 60s, but I don't know when officially it opened. Stella, and one of the things about the deed, I found the deed online, and it said that he retained the right to continue running his livery. So he had like a little 30-foot corner of there where he could still do his boat thing. His wife, Stella, George's wife, Stella Hacklander, died in 1954, and George just said, the heck with it, and he moved to Florida. Unfortunately, he died shortly thereafter, too. Another family has owned this southern part for about 50 years, and I met the gentleman that lives there recently and have started to talk to him, but haven't learned much from him yet. I'm hoping to cultivate that and learn a little more. In 1964, so that's why it's called the Hacklander boat. I always wanted to know, why is it called the Hacklander boat launch? It's because they bought the property from George Hacklander. In 1964, a couple called the Fowlers bought this property next door, and Damon and Alyce Walker joined them in 1965. They were both black couples who had worked for R.J. Peterson in Gary, Indiana. And in 1972, the Fowlers, I guess, decided, yeah, this isn't for me, and they sold the land to the Walkers. And the Walkers launched a place called Walker's Landing. Kudos to Sally Winters for finding this ad. It was an African-American friendly lodging, place where people could go and stay, and there was a marina, they could park their boats there, they could, I'll show you a little bit more. And many of the visitors had done construction work. Some of them were other people who had worked for R.J. Peterson, and so they knew to come up. And they helped the Walkers build the site in sort of exchange for the ability to use the spot. I'm told that several of the guards from the Saugatuck Dunes Correctional Facility also lived there during part of the time. So this is a little bit hard to see, but this is an aerial picture. This is Riverside here, and here's the river up here. So if you know the area, they've just built a house right here, a new house. And so this is 1984, right? And so you can see there were 2 houses. These were evidently used as like dormitory, so people could stay here. But there were also these pads. There were a dozen of these pads where they could park trailers, right? So you can, if you're close enough, you can see there's a couple of trailers. There's also a few cabins out here. And one of the things that the Walkers did was they developed this little, I guess you'd call it a causeway, across here, and you can see the water goes under here, and there are 12 boat slips out on the water. And there are some utility poles out here that you can still see. I don't know if the new owners took them down, but you could still see them a year or two ago. I want to say these pictures I'm using with permission from this vintage aerial website, which is a pretty cool place. They have all kinds of aerial photos that you can buy, but they're willing to let you use them for these kinds of purposes. So here you can see those pads a little bit more clearly. So they had this facility, and frankly, there's very little known about it. It obviously had some success, but I've never found articles or stories other than what I've told you. And I talked to Ken Kussel, who did the presentation a little while ago, and he really didn't learn a whole lot either.
Would that have been in the Green Book?
A good question. It was not in the Green Book because the Green Book stopped being published in 1966. But if it was still published, it would certainly have been in there. So it was just a few years after they did the Green Book.
Is the area all overgrown now, or what?
No, I'll show you another aerial picture later, but this is sort of a field. This is kind of mucky here, but the current owners are fixing this up, and I'll show you they actually built a dock out there. It's unclear. So Damon Walker, the husband, died in 1976, pretty soon after they started. And Alyce, the wife, was evidently a pretty colorful person. She wore a turban and flip-flops, and she had a bit of a bawdy sense of humor, so she was quite the character. It's unclear to me how long the place was working. The ad, I believe, was from the 80s, so I'm thinking it went through at least the late 80s that it was still active. Alyce Walker died in 1994, and she was fairly old at the time, so I'm not sure if she was still running the place, but I would love to, some of you know more about that, please let me know. And in 2002, Fred Gergeri, who owns the Antiques Mall, I believe, is a real estate investor. Does that name ring a bell with anybody? That's the name I got from Ken Kussel. He bought the land from the estate, from the Walker's estate. He wanted to develop log home condos. Some of you may remember that project trying to go through. And he couldn't do it because he couldn't get water. It was too expensive to get water there or to dig a well. The water for the Walker's Landing came from across the street, from a well across the street. So he sold the land a few years ago, very recently, just like 2 or 3 years ago. And the new house has gone up, and they've built a private landing. Here's one of the utility poles, right? Those are from back in the old days. I would dearly love to just walk through that land. One of these days I'm going to go introduce myself to those people, and I'm going to send them the video and see if they'll let me walk around. The area east of Mack's Landing has also evolved over the years. Back in the 1880s, the Purdys put up a gravel pit. And this is the best picture I've ever been able to find of the gravel pit. It's an aerial shot from 1955. And again, here's Riverside, right? Here's the Hacklander boat launch, right? And this is where the gravel pit was. And it had been there already for 70 years, right? Cleo Arndt, who was the husband of Alice Dawson's grandniece, inherited the property. You can see his name on that little family tree if you want. He inherited the property in 1949, and he kept running the gravel pit. In 1956, interestingly, bones were found in the gravel pit. And they were evaluated at the University of Michigan, and the archaeologists said they dated at least to 200 BC. So there have been people around here for a long time. The gravel pit continued operating until 1966, and interestingly, in 1969, there was an incident where a man was shot and wounded there at the abandoned gravel pit. The circumstances were a little fuzzy, evidently. You can read about it in the commercial record. The shooter got probation eventually. And he wasn't a very smart guy, and he violated his probation, and so he ended up going to prison for several years. Here's how the area looked after the gravel pit closed. Again, it's hard to see because it's an aerial shot, and some of you are a little far away, but it's no longer being used as a gravel pit. And there's a little red spot here. Jim, I think it was Dee Dee Hansen told me that they were a little afraid about this area. Larry, my neighbor who lives around here, knows that there's a little drop off here. If you're walking down Riverside, if you're coming down Riverside, this is somewhat steep. And they were afraid that if they kept digging into the gravel pit, the road would collapse. So they were kind of happy that the gravel pit closed. You can see a little teeny bit of Walker's Landing-y things happening. So it's only a couple of years after they got started. So they hadn't done quite everything yet. There are no slips out here, but they're beginning to start building the Walker's Landing. In 1966, Arthur Voss announced plans to develop a trailer park and a marina where the gravel pit had been located. And by 1969, you can see Waterland Village. And it is now called Riverside Estates, but it was originally called Waterland Village. In 1987, Fred Emmerich bought the western part and developed into Deep Harbor Marina. And so you can see the boat slips here. This is another person I want to talk to. I'd like to talk to the owners of this place and see if maybe they have some pictures or old information about these. So that's kind of the summary of what I've learned. Some of it sticks together, but it gives you an interesting picture of this sort of forgotten place. Today, this is an odd view from Google Earth. So we're looking at the mobile home park and the landing, and here's the Hacklanders. So it's a different angle, kind of sort of a fake view flying in that Google Earth will do for you. But there's no remnant of Allie Dawson's home anymore. Riverside Farm, that burned down in 1978, and I walk by there all the time, and I haven't seen anything. Someone has just built a home right next to that, and I'd like to knock on their door and say, do you mind if I walk around in the woods by your house and see if I find anything? There's no trace of Cleo's Arndt's gravel pit. There's no cider mill. The cider mill that was across, there was a cider mill at one point across the street from where the gravel pit was. The boat launch is gone. There's no sign of that. I haven't seen anything. I walk up there all the time. And there was once a baseball field on Henry Mead's property, evidently. And that's gone. The last of the Walker's Landing buildings was torn down a couple years ago. I was kind of sad to see that go, but I totally understand. It was just this beat up old barn. The Mack's Landing School remains, though. As I said, it looks like any other house inside, but it's still nice to see it there. It's the oldest thing out there anymore. And those are two other homes that I told you about. There have been several new homes that have gone up. Some on the bluff overlooking past where Mack's Landing is. Some on the south side of Riverside, they're starting to build houses there. And so far they're fairly tasteful. I hate to see any trees get torn down, but they've been pretty good about it. And I kind of find it interesting that not everybody needs to live in town or near the beach. You know, it's kind of nice. Riverside is still a dirt road once you get past 62nd Street, and I just love walking there. I feel like when I walk past those new homes and into the woods, I kind of can imagine I'm back in 1875. So my goals tonight were to tell you a little bit of the begin to tell the story of this pretty much forgotten place. I hope you feel like you've got at least a sense of what it was like. And what I'm hoping is that I can shake a little bit out of information from you all as well. I have still a lot to learn. I'd love to learn more. I think it'd be fun to try to put a book together with pictures and so forth. I still feel I know very little, and I have lots of questions. But now it's your turn.